Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for staying. I do get that feeling that I'm about to feed you your vegetables, right? So I hope that given the room of creatives, given the theme tonight on storytelling, given that a few people have peppered, right, the importance of sustainability to continue your creative endeavors, that Manal was talking about, bringing storytelling into things that, and Jassim talked about, potential for public funding that needs to be expanded in the region. So hopefully there's some good seeds for our conversation tonight. But I'm looking forward to the creative perspective to juice up the vegetables a bit. So with that in mind, our lovely panelists tonight, we start with Noaf, who shared some lovely insights in the last hour. Hopefully you're ready to continue. You know her as co-founder of Coot Market, yes. She's a brand strategist, an experience curator, an industry disruptor at home and abroad, yes. Next to her is Dr. Noaf, an academic like myself, assistant professor of management at Kuwait University and consultant for the National Fund for Small and Medium Enterprises in Kuwait. And finally, we have Hashim Behbehani, co-founder, COO of Coded, entrepreneur at large, and with many experiences to share, he says. So, with that in mind, I want to start with you guys. So, what is the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the words diversifying revenue? What's that first instinct?
I know that all three of us sitting up here have very different industries that we work in, so I can only speak for myself. But for me, it's not just personally, it's also because I do client work and I do personal projects. But to me, it means if you have a business idea and it's sent out there into the world, and then it interacts with its environment, and then organically, occasionally, there'll be a need for something to be a branch of what you originally created. So if that sounds really obscure, an example would be, for example, we started Coot Market. It was a platform for certain types of businesses, and then it was brand new the first year, and then we had no idea if anyone would be interested in it. And then it sort of took a life of its own, and it brought like-minded people out of the woodwork that we didn't necessarily know existed before. And then once we had them all, we were like, oh my God, this is actually a vast pool of knowledge that we want to tap into. So we decided to do a series of workshops called Nourish, and we wanted them to be free, and they're in both English and Arabic. This is back in 2014. But of course, going back to our first conversation with the previous panel, funding is an issue. So because Coot Market is financially successful, everyone wants in. So if something is culturally valuable, that they don't see value in it, there's no commercial value to it, it's much harder. So we struggled a bit, but we eventually got funding for that. So to me, that was like an offshoot called Nourish, and it's workshops. So we diversified. But we got tired fighting government for legislation. So we had to focus on our original plan, but we did attempt to do it. So I would say that an organic need for more out of your original idea from a larger society.
Thank you for having me. For me, diversifying revenue means continuous development and strategy. As an academic, today I was just reading a case about Kodak. Mm-hmm. So Kodak used to sell cameras and used to sell the film. Mm-hmm. But their idea was always that we make money out of the film. Mm-hmm. So for every piece of picture you took, they made $1 out of it because you had to buy the film. Mm-hmm. So they really neglected the camera, and all they focused on was the film. And they grew exponentially. Mm-hmm. They had reached $10 billion in sales. And then digital camera came in, and now the film is worthless. So how can you go from a $10 billion company where most of your revenue is based on the film to a new product that doesn't even require one single cent? I think they over-invested in film, and they didn't really diversify into the equipment, into different areas. Even though they actually, which was interesting, I just learned this, they were the first company to develop the digital camera.
Exactly.
But they were just so focused on this money-making machine they didn't diversify outside of it. So it's kind of like a mindset of continuously developing, looking for new things, and setting the strategy to not fail. Some say Kodak could have avoided it if they were more creative. Some say it was just too big, that there's no way a $10 billion company that relied on film only and not the people, the creative people, would be able to survive. So diversifying revenue is always looking for new ways to survive in the market.
Just to continue on what Dr. Nawaf was saying, I think the first thing that pops into my mind is diversifying revenue is about de-risking. It's about mitigating risk. And sometimes that's about diversifying the product line, as my co-panelists here have mentioned. But sometimes it's also about diversifying who pays you, what type of customer pays you. In our case with Coded, we started with a tuition model. We still continue with a tuition model, B2C. So the customer pays a tuition, they enroll in the bootcamp. Slowly we realized that that market was limiting, and it was a little, as with Kodak, maybe it wasn't smart for us to completely place all our eggs into that basket. So we started to look at different types of customers with different types of payment schemes. For example, enterprises who require coding education and coding bootcamps, they're a different type of customer, and you get paid differently as a B2B client. Another thing that we started doing is we get paid out of a recruitment fee for any employer who employs our graduates. That means that if one day the B2C market that we were reliant on day one started to shrink, we have a couple of more revenue streams that come from different customers with different needs that we can rely on to diversify and de-risk. So for me, to continue on what they said, diversifying revenue is about not having all your revenue eggs in one basket and not being reliant on one type of customer, but rather spreading that across several types of customers.
So Dr. Noaf, we spoke about a lot of examples in that opening explanation. Can you give a little shortened kind of summary of the kinds of revenue diversification that are possible and relevant to the creative industries?
So there's a lot of different ways. I think one of the things that recently caught my attention was this idea of cooptation. I've always read about it. I studied the concept of cooptation, but I never really cared about it much. It's basically collaborating with your competitors. That's basically it. So I never really paid attention to it. But then I recently read that in Olympic runs, there's only one winner, right? So you run 400 sprint, 200 sprint, there's only one winner. But they actually train together. So I was surprised. I mean, like, why do they train together? I like sports, so I got into it even more. Then I realized that basketball teams or hockey teams, when there's a big rival and the rival wins, the next year the other team does better. I dug deeper into it, and I heard Federer thanking Nadal after his win for some of the recommendations. Then I heard one of Barcelona's players saying he misses Cristiano Ronaldo because he added extra competition. So the whole idea was that competition actually helps you because it diversifies your revenue streams. So let me give you some business examples of that idea. Microsoft was was facing legal issues because of its monopoly, because of its size. And what happened is basically they saved Apple. They saved Apple because, one, they wanted to protect themselves from any claims of monopoly. So now there's a competitor, it didn't go away. And number two, part of the deal was Microsoft would now be able to sell its products through Apple. They didn't really think about it that way before. They saw them as a pure competitor. But now that was a new revenue stream for them. Another example would be Amazon. So Amazon has this thing called Amazon Marketplace. Basically, Amazon sells its own products, but they also have a marketplace where any small business owner can sell their own products. So they're actually competing with Amazon's own product and inventory, right? In 2019, 54%, I think, basically more than 50% of Amazon's revenue came from these SMEs. So actually, cooperating with your competition can give you new revenue streams. My last example would be Samsung and Apple. There's a lawsuit going on between them too. Apple says Samsung is copying them and all that, yet Samsung sells its screens to Apple. So I think a lot of times we think about competition, especially when the whole thing about carriage, talabat, and the Kuwaiti businesses, and that we need to get rid of these companies because they're a monopoly and they're not helping local businesses. I think we need to rethink competition, and you can actually find synergies and ways where both of you benefit rather than a zero-sum game, basically.
In any of your
In our case, it's a little bit tricky because we don't have, well, we, at least not until last year, we didn't have a competitor, a direct competitor for 4 or 5 years. But we knew there were alternatives. One of the alternatives is traditional education, so universities. So we started reaching out to universities. Just as Dr. Nawaf said, we realized we don't need to be competing with them, rather we need to be sourcing from them, because a lot of our high potential students come directly from universities. That led to us creating a whole product, which is our Fresh Grad Bootcamp, specifically tailored for students who had just graduated from university. And that way we started working more directly with these universities. We have booths at GUST, KU, AUK, all of the big universities in Kuwait, and now we work directly with both their student bodies, their student clubs, as well as their faculty and admin to find us the best talent so that we can put them there. In fact, we were just talking about it literally before the panel started. So that's one way we've done it, with sort of an alternative / competitor.
Okay.
I think for us, the only reason why this doesn't exist is because even after 7 years, we're kind of in a really hostile legislative environment. So we're in free fall, basically. So there is nobody who could find a footing and be our competitor because none of it makes sense. So I think even after 7 years, it's early. So we're hoping that now we sort of got a little bit of a foothold this year, still working on that to make it better, but in the future perhaps. But at the moment, we're by ourselves. We're an island.
What else have you tried in the interim then? You mentioned the Nourish program, but have you tried to diversify in different ways?
And we used to do something called Farm Table, where we do farm visits, because we realized, because we love doing something like a farmer's market, is because it's part of my childhood. When I was a kid, I was in America, and we used to go to the farms and pick our own fruit. And that's sort of, it's part of cultural education. We felt like it was lacking here. So this attitude of nothing grows here comes from nobody being shown how it works, and how would you ever know if you didn't pull something out of the ground yourself? Like, I learned a lot through the process. I'm continuously learning myself, but we also try to do that. So like farm tourism, ecotourism, and then we were just so clobbered by all the basics of just maintaining a grip on our main market that we had to refocus on that. But now it's taken off. So now people are going to farms on the weekend. I see those farms. Some of them were at our market and people know who they are. And now it's become part of the culture. So instead of claiming it as our own, it's sort of like we put that idea out of we're the instigator, and it snowballed into something amazing, which is the end result we wanted anyway. But it's other people picking up where we left off, which is cool.
Have either of you tried something that failed? I mean, you said that the government regulations are sort of cutting you off before you try, but have you actually attempted to diversify in a way that didn't succeed?
I mean, I can speak about that extensively, but one example that I would give is one way we tried to diversify was geographically. So we wanted to find new markets, physical new locations that we're able to penetrate and maybe have a different sort of customer there. But we ended up doing that too early. And the lesson we learned from this experience, and this is true for creatives especially, is you need to solidify your first revenue stream. You need to make a name for yourself from your first revenue stream, get a reputation, and then start thinking about new frontiers. And sometimes literally new frontiers, as in maybe a new country. We tried to expand geographically too quickly. In fact, we tried to do it with a team of 3 full-time employees, which, in retrospect, sounds insane. But at that time, it was a great idea, of course. But now, when we actually did it, we had a team of about 20. And that's when we felt kind of comfortable. We still felt stretched. Some of my operation team is in the back, and they'll vouch for that, and they'll tell you they felt stretched. But we got it done right at that time. So definitely failure can be from fear of missing out, FOMO. You want to avoid that. You want to solidify that first revenue stream, and then move on to diversifying through possible expansions.
For us, exactly what you said was my biggest fear, right? So as a personality, it's my personality to be very careful and calculating. So I know it's a gut feeling, and nothing feels right before it's time, that I'm not going to branch out. So for us, like we were approached by the UAE, the government, that wanted us to do like a showcase Qut market at City Walk before, when it was first being developed, their Ministry of Happiness. خلف الله علينا. And they invited us over and they said, you can do this and come for 5 days and do a showcase Qut market. We'll give you whatever you want. And I felt like, and even we get calls from Saudi Arabia, because now, of course, it's booming, it's amazing. I went to Riyadh last month and I thought it was incredible. My heart was racing the whole time, I couldn't sleep. But for me, what you were saying is correct. I need to make sure my foothold in my home base is okay first, and I don't feel like we're there yet. So I'm too careful to make that leap until I'm sure. متمكنة.
So we've heard examples of gut feelings and, trial and error, so to speak. So Dr. Noaf, what should an entrepreneur consider when they're seeking to diversify their revenue streams? Are there points of consideration or ways to organize the options that could help make a selection?
Sure. I think his story actually reminded me of something very interesting. I think one of the most important things I always try to emphasize is that you need to have a very, very, very clear idea of what your vision is or what your company's goal is. You need to be very clear about that from the get-go. That makes a lot of choices and decisions much easier. So his example, building on that, when I asked Khalej, Abdallah Mtawa, and the guys about their idea, they said, we started the business with the goal of selling it. So they had an exit strategy. They wanted to sell the company within 1 or 2 years. So when the decision came to open up in Bahrain or not, Hashim just said they opened up too quickly, because his vision or goal, I think if I remember correctly, because I interviewed him before, wasn't to sell the company for a quick buck. So maybe that decision wasn't right at that time. But for them, they knew they weren't ready, but they didn't care. Because what they found out is that if they want to get sold, they need to understand what the companies that would acquire local SMEs want. And at that time, they just acquired Talabat, right? And they found out that these companies care about the number of customers you have or the number of restaurants you have more than the profit you have. So it doesn't matter if you're losing money as long as you have 70% market share, or you're open in more than one location, or you have more than 100 restaurants. So the idea of opening up in Bahrain fit that strategy. Yes, we will lose money. Yes, we won't make money in Bahrain, but we will say that we are operational in 2 countries, and we will make noise, and we'll make them pay attention to us. So that idea was very clear. The decision was very clear. The strategy was very clear. They knew the risk, but they wanted to do it because of what their goal was. Let's compare it to a very successful company like PIC. PIC is one of the most successful startups in Kuwait. They just recently, and I'm not even sure they actually fully did it, opened in Saudi Arabia. So why? I asked them, why don't you open? You're expanded in Kuwait, you've proven your success, you have a successful operations strategy and everything. And his idea was the same as what these guys were just saying. He's not ready. He wants a sustainable company. He wants this company to be his legacy. He wants to hand over this company to his children, possibly one day. So he's not in a rush to open up and possibly lose. He'd rather have 100% of the market here and then slowly make small baby steps outside, because he's not looking for high growth. So the decision to not open up was very clear for him, because that's not within his goals. So I think, to summarize my answer to your question, my long answer is all of that. My short answer is, know what you want. Do you want to increase the number of customers, or do you want to make revenue? Do you want to reduce profit? Why did you open this company? Khaleej, Abdallah Mtawa wanted to make money for themselves, not necessarily for the company. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. That's a great thing, maybe. It's not their responsibility, whatever happens to Khaleej after that. So that you have to be very clear why you want to open this business.
So what can we pull out of that then? Those were some great examples, but from more commercial, food businesses and larger businesses, if we're talking about small, maybe independent or quasi-independent, creative industries in Kuwait, which is why we're here tonight. How does that change? Can you narrow that focus a little bit just to?
In full disclosure, I'm a management professor, not a finance or revenue professor. I am very bad at creativity and innovation. I don't want to teach that subject because I'm not good at it. I know a lot of stories, I know a lot of business management, but in terms of creativity, I think you have two very creative people surrounding me. So.
Noaf, you talked about your prowess as a storyteller. So can you translate?
Yeah. So I think you have to think about your motivations for going into a business. Mm-hmm. So like what you were talking about. So for something like what I do, it's a hostile landscape. It's insane. It's very fly by the seat of your pants. There's no financial mapping ahead. I have no idea what the government's going to do to me next season. I have no idea who's coming along for the ride, who's going to, like, the new big boss, who's going to fight me. Mm-hmm. And it takes its toll financially. So the way we operate is that we're a lean operation. We actually love what we do, love to hate to love it, whatever it is. But it's a personal passion, and it takes up every single waking moment of our lives, even when it's off season. But that's the way that we like to do it. So I would say consider your reason. So if people think, for example, they see people at the top of the food chain, these big companies doing cool things in Kuwait, and think, that's what I want to do, because they hear numbers, right? It was bought out for this much. If that's your motivation, you're doomed to fail before you begin. Mm-hmm. And it's not, I don't know if that was the best advice, but for me, like, you have to really love what you're doing, because it doesn't work if it's contrived, people can tell. So I think maybe a small example would be when the market came out, and then there were, in the first 2 seasons, there were like 10 copycat markets that came out, and then they all dissipated within the first season because they didn't realize how hard it is. And I think that's a very Kuwaiti attitude. If they can do it, I can do it too, you know, which is not untrue. But it also takes a lot more discipline and vision and passion than what the surface implies.
One thing I'd add here is, and that goes to what Noaf said earlier as well, as a creative, you are naturally inclined to try and experiment and see what happens. But when it comes to your revenue stream and your product, something that's commercialized for something in a situation where they're in the creative industry, you have to have discipline. And discipline is really key. And discipline is about saying no. I think Steve Jobs has a famous saying of saying, 99% of management is saying no. Something like that, I don't know. But that's actually very true, because as a creative, you're very much inclined to get pulled in different directions. And that's true both in terms of what you produce as art, as product, but also true in terms of how you sell it and to whom you sell it. And your customers, different customers, when you're diversifying revenue, will have different needs. So it's very, very important not to get pulled. And by the way, the reason we went to Saudi is exactly the reason Noaf didn't. And we had somebody come in and they're like, we like you guys, you have to come to Riyadh. And this was before Riyadh, what would say, this is 2016. You have to, and we didn't say no. And after that, we realized this is gonna happen more than once. And then, Oman came knocking on the door, UAE came knocking on the door, and we had to assess each and every situation, exactly like Dr. Nawaf said. We had to assess it by our own playbook, by our own vision. And most of the time you're going to find it doesn't fit, because that doesn't make sense. Your vision is pretty much singular and unique to your company, at least. So most of the time opportunities coming externally will not fit the vision. And in certain situations, it is fruitful to tweak your playbook, to tweak your guidelines slightly to allow for a new opportunity. But that's very rarely the case. And it's never the case if it's a huge pivot. You're doing X and then suddenly you're doing Y just because somebody comes knocking on the door. So discipline is absolutely key.
Well, on that note, Noaf, you had talked about personal experience with a different kind of balance, and that's as a creative balancing the energy you put towards the business, right? Diversifying sustainability, financial issues, and also nurturing the creative side of you independently for your own art projects or side projects. So how would you give advice to others about how to find that balance?
I would say that for every person, it's going to be their own journey. I know that sounds really hippie and sounds like really out there, but honestly, you need to learn to develop your own gut feeling in your inner voice. Because if you constantly depend on other people's opinions or constantly need to bounce your ideas off other people to feel valued for your ideas, you're doomed to fail. Because if you're the first to do something, you're the first to do something. So how can someone who's never done what you've done before advise you? They can't. So you need to learn to depend on yourself. So for me, there's a certain pace. Like what I did was literally try everything. I graduated didn't like my first job, even though it was what I studied. It wasn't what I thought it was going to be. Didn't know what I wanted to do, but knew I needed to get the heck out of there. And I know this is not for everyone, right? So that's another thing that we have to go back to, like, what are your motivations, right? So if to you it's like, oh, I don't want a desk job just to be, and you think it's like a free ride, it's not. It's actually a lot harder than working for someone else, because you're never not the captain of the ship, and you can never take a break. It'll hit the iceberg. You know what I mean? So I don't know if that answers the question, but
how do you then carve that space for yourself with the pressures?
It's sort of, you know, when you're so stressed out that you're calm. I honestly, I don't know how
knowing
to say
your limit.
Like, it's through training, because if it's because I had no one to mentor me, I had no one who did what I was doing, I had no one to ask a question. Like, both my parents are scientists. They work in like medical research, super serious jobs. My brother's a chemical engineer. No one around me was doing what I was doing. Nobody made me feel less valuable because I was doing my own thing. But also, it comes back to discipline. So I was always a very serious child. So if you look serious about what you're doing, people take you seriously. But then you feel the burden of success, right? So you're like, okay, they trusted me to do my own thing. And you just have to not freak out and develop your inner voice. So that's what happens for me. So nothing affects me anymore. And so that's why I'm able to, like, all the things I've been through brought me to the point where I was approached by someone in the region, and I was able to say, that doesn't feel right. I don't think the timing's right. Pass. It's everyone's pace, I think, will be different. I don't know. I'm sorry. That wasn't helpful.
Don't apologize. That's perfect.
Maybe one thing I'll add about finding balance is sometimes it's a good idea not to make something that you love a business. Just keep it as a hobby, as an interest, because whether we like it or not, when you commercialize something, there is a lot of connotation that goes with that. There's a lot of other things that will end up being part of that job. And it is a job. It's commercialization. And I remember in the early days, one of the things that my co-founder and I really enjoyed was that aspect of producing the entire bootcamp, putting it together. And it feels like it's an 8-week continuous event. So I can relate to that, to the passion that Noaf speaks about. And that's always been something that drove us, especially in the early days. But eventually you start dealing with, you know, accounting, legal, strategy, and whatnot. You put together a team, and you get further and further removed from that aspect. And so other things in your life, maybe keep them away from, you know, commercialization. Keep them as a hobby, keep them as an interest, keep them away from that stress and pressure and the need to grow, the need to make money from them, so that they aren't tainted.
They're tainted. So mentioning your lack of mentorship, just in closing the panel, can you guys each give like a piece of advice, be the mentors to the room? What did you need to hear, right, 10 years ago or 5 years ago? That might benefit the audience.
So actually, I'm just listening to this, and I'm remembering most people think, and most studies show that entrepreneurs are very stressed out. But there was a fascinating study done last year, and they put the fMRI on people's brains, and they actually saw that entrepreneurs are happier than non-entrepreneurs. So, in terms of advice, I think my main advice would be don't rush in. Don't rush in. I think we have this kind of we're fixated on being the first. I'm the first to do this. I'm the first to do that. I'm the first. We hear about first mover advantage. So you're the first in the market. You're gonna get a big amount of the market share. Actually, that's not really true. Most studies find that settlers instead of pioneers. This Adam Grant's book on originals. It's basically saying that before Nintendo, there was a video game. Before Netflix, other companies started to do the same thing. So actually, waiting for the market, learning from the market, makes you puts you in a better position to make better decisions. So I think don't rush in. I'd say don't rush in even in terms of, sorry, I can't help it. قدم استقالتك. No. Don't quit your job. Don't jump in. No. There was a study actually, they tracked on around 30,000 entrepreneurs for 12 years. It was published in 2014, and what they found was that people who kept their day jobs are actually 3 times more successful than people who quit their jobs and start a business. I'm just talking about starting the business. So actually, what the study shows is that it takes a certain discipline and risk aversion to start a business, see how it goes, and then make the decision to leave your job. Because that job can actually give you stability, can put you at ease in terms of stress. You can use the money from your job to fund your business. And a lot of successful entrepreneurs, so I always give the example of Phil Knight, you know, what's his famous quote? Just do it, right? He didn't just do it. He stayed as a professor for 7 years after starting Nike. 7 years, because he wanted to make sure this company would succeed. So I would say, take your time. A lot of the great original creative people have a lot of bad ideas, bad products, from Shakespeare to Beethoven to you name it. They have a lot of Edison. He's famous for saying, I tried 10,000 different things, but I learned 99,000 ways of not doing it. So have the discipline to try, but take your time. Don't rush in. Don't be the first. You'll get there if you have a really good idea. Try more than once, and then you'll get there.
Okay.
My advice, two quick pieces of advice. The first one is get enough sleep. And I mean that seriously. There's like a ton of research and studies about how a good 8 hours night's worth of sleep will help you just be a better whatever you are. The second thing is, as a creative, and I think that's the thing that kind of unites everyone here, remain in that problem-solving mindset. And that's your strongest asset. That's the thing that you can rely on the most. That's the confidence that you need to have in yourself. You are a problem solver first and foremost. Whatever it is that you do, as you heard in the panel before this one, you're going to run into obstacles. Stay in that problem-solving mindset. And if you stay in that problem-solving mindset, you're going to find yourself, you know, trespassing maybe is the right word, on new territory that you didn't realize has opportunity. So when you just think about, well, I want to solve problems, maybe it's other people's problem, maybe it's your own, you're going to end up getting great products with great customers, and inshallah, great business that you can build on top of. So get enough sleep and continue solving problems.
You know, I think I wanted to hear what they're saying, because I'm very impressed by what both my co-panelists had to say today. Very impressive. But I would say to build on a little bit, wallah, and you reflected a lot of what I feel, aslan. So for me, what you were saying about getting sleep, so for me, my whole attitude, so if people say, Noaf, you as Noaf, give me advice, my whole attitude to things in life have always been chill but hustle. Right? So if you're going too hard, sometimes you're wearing horse blinders and you're not looking right and left, and dish batofa, like you'll hit a wall. You know what I mean? Because you're not, you need to look, you need to chill out, you need to relax. If you're very intense, like if you see something, you're like, oh, I want to be like him, and like hard work, it's like, you need to relax. All my best ideas come when I'm not actively thinking about my next project or my next idea. So everyone has their own pace, but you need to chill for a minute. And then when my friends always make fun of me, because whenever I drive in the car, I never have music on, because I like to be silent so I can think, and they call me a psychopath. They think people who don't listen to music in the car are psychopaths. Well, I'm like, yeah, you know, you want to be me if I'm a psychopath.
But I think they've shown that just taking a walk is one of the best ways to unleash creative juices. So maybe the Kuwait version of that is, for me, so driving in the car with silence.
This is what, I don't know, like silence. And then also I'm very introverted, which no one will believe, but my job requires me to be an extrovert, and it requires me to deal with a lot of different people. So for my line of work, my time to recalibrate is to be by myself. So I even travel alone once a year for a couple of months to recalibrate, and not even to necessarily actively think about my business or businesses, because it was never my goal to be where I am today. It just organically happened because there was a need, and it developed, and I went along for the ride, and I have an inner voice. So my second piece of advice would be, other than chill but hustle, would be stop asking everyone for advice. Not me. Right? I'll tell you why. Because it's good to listen. So when you were speaking, I was just like, wow, he has some amazing things to say. You can learn from Bill Gates, you can learn from Amazon, but then you have to go back and then internalize it and think of your own ideas and forge your own path and think of your own direction. So a lot of times it's like taking a step back and analyzing the situation. Be like, okay, what are the cards that I'm dealt, right? So for me, when I moved back and I was like, okay, I started my first job, I was like, I don't know what's going on here, y'all are nuts, I need to get out of here. But I was like, I never thought I'd be creating events, and I tried a bunch of different things until I ended up where I am today. But it basically came out of a need for when I looked internally, I'm like, okay, what's missing? What's my deck of cards? Is that we're in Kuwait. A lot of times people have a lot of free time. Funding is not usually a problem for the most part if you really want it. But if it's like, wow, is that my biggest problem? Is that I'm bored? Well, let me do something about it, right? So it's like it came out of a need to fill a void that existed. So whether it's my line of work or you have another idea. So when we first started, for example, tap payments, Ali Hussein, like he started around the same time as Qut, and we're the first people that they use their services for. And man, I gave him such a hard time because in the early days, people used to just pay us like whatever. We didn't use an automated system, and like and he had to sell it to me so hard, and I was so resistant to it. Maskeen. Now we're good friends, and then he with time grew with Qut, so everybody knew what tap was, and then he diversified his revenue, and now we use all three of his products. He has 3 new products that we use for every aspect. So chill but hustle, learn to rely on yourself. My bad. Okay. I'll say it nicer this time.
Well, thank you guys. Words of wisdom from these 3, hard-earned wisdom, it sounds like. So thank you.
And this is honestly not really a question. It's more of a compliment to you, Noaf, because you were talking about the, let's say, the internal social pressure of doing something different, not really scientific compared to your family. But I just want to say, like, the product that you've created is so popular to the point that when the government comes knocking and tries to stop you, I know you're working hard not to let them fight you too hard, but at the same time, the coalition that you've created, aka your audience, does your job for you.
Yeah,
so honestly,
I've been
amazing
very
job
lucky.
on that.
I had backup come to the rescue. I didn't even know I had.
Yeah, without even asking for it. I mean, so honestly, that's
honestly that day, that's what I cried about, because I was so grateful for لما الله أمك تدعي لك الله يسخر لك من عباد الصالحين. That's what happened that day. So I'm a very lucky person, but it's a very strange place to be, let me tell you. And to this day, it's still a fight. So it's bizarro land. I don't know.
Yeah, honestly, I do feel like that's amazing. But what I would personally add to it is, I was just discussing it with one of my colleagues, is that even us at Coded, we might sometimes push a workshop or 2 because we don't want something to fall under the same dates as your product, aka Kut, because that's an audience that's guaranteed to go that way. So honestly, kudos on that. So you have an incredible audience and all of us. So yeah, I know it's not a question, but it's something at least.
See, you guys keep doing this to me. I'm looking for questions. No, I'm just joking. For someone who's a freelancer, who has always been sheltered under bigger companies, because I'm that baby mdallal mal all the ad agencies. Like they bring me in as a think tank, well, like a one-man think tank, and then they're like, go, be. But what if I wanted to do my own thing, and I don't have the know-how for anything financial, and I do not have a partner that would help me to get my own business off the ground.
Okay.
So that's my question to all of you.
So as a freelancer in a creative industry, so when I left my first job, it was in PR. I studied PR. I didn't, I just want to do my own thing. Here's the number one thing that shocked me about me, and I'm sure it applies to everyone. You will figure it out. So if I wanted to know how to, for example, when you worked at an agency, you see how they invoice, so you learn the basics, right? You know how to email, you know how to invoice, how it works, there's books for that. So anything ever since my childhood that I wanted to learn, I would just sit in the rows of books, pull out books from the bookshelf, and literally take notes. So for example, for the freelancer's guide, there's a guidebook on how to charge and how to scale it to the size of the company, and it's out there. So is back to rely on yourself, read books, figure it out, and jarrab. And if it sucks the first couple of times, take a hit the first few times. So before anyone knew who I was, it's a lot harder to sell yourself if they don't know the kind of work you have. Because now that I'm a grown-up, like I understand why they're jaded, right? Because if a freelancer comes, how do I know you're gonna deliver on what you promise? So I need to see a track record, So it's gonna suck either way in the beginning. So might as well read books and try your best, and I promise you'll learn way faster than you think.
One thing I'd like to add here is you can make an investment in getting a part-time accountant as a bookkeeper, or you can use one of my favorite companies in Kuwait, Keepers. They do the bookkeeping for you. Yeah. So for a nominal fee of something like 250, 300 KD a month. I didn't get paid to say this, but they're really good. But they'll take care of your books. I mean, you still have to have that basic know-how, but honestly, it's not rocket science, and anybody who can count to 10 can probably do the basics. But 100%, one of the best investments you make early days, a good bookkeeper. Have them sort out everything. You just worry about what you do.
My name is Abdullah Al-Hassan. I'm an Coded alumni. Right now I'm working on a startup. So I have a question regarding a business model. Throughout the research, not just in Kuwait, حتى بالعالم, we are seeing that all businesses are moving forward with subscription models. And we never know when is the best time to start from selling a product by itself or starting a subscription. So how I would assess the situation to decide what is the right model for my business.
So he deferred to me, but I'm going to defer back to you because I want to learn your answer. But I think what you're talking about, a very easy way is kind of upselling. What I mean by that is, let's say LinkedIn, right? You have free LinkedIn, but then they show you 2 people viewed your profile, but there's 10 more that you can't see unless you subscribe. So you can offer a basic service basically, and then pay more for subscription. Yesterday I was just watching a morning show on Apple TV. I didn't want to sign up. I already have Netflix. But after 2 episodes, I was hooked, and yeah. Cliffhangers get me. I'm curious. So I think you don't have to just have one way. You can sell a product, and then once they're hooked on that product, you can upsell and offer a more premium product through subscription. I think that's my answer.
The only thing, that's a great answer, and the only thing I add to it is when you're small, don't be afraid of trying these things. And sometimes you get caught up in where you are and you think, but what if we try this and then we go back to something else, or we change it completely and then people freak out. When you're small, the beautiful thing is most people don't know you, so you can take a chance or two before you figure it out. And you'd be surprised how many businesses change their business model, even when they're mature and big and worth billions of dollars. So give it a try and see what works best for your customers.